Chapter 15 of Part 1 of the Lives of the Three Misses Judsons, by Arabella M. Wilson. This recording is in the public domain. Messrs. Judson and Price visit Ava. Their reception at court. Their return to Rangoon. Mrs. Judson's return. A letter to her parents describing their removal to Ava. Description of Ava. It was mentioned that during Mrs. Judson's absence from Burma, Dr. Price, the fame of whose medical skill had reached the golden ears, had been ordered to Ava, and that Mr. Judson had determined to make another attempt to procure toleration for the Christians by a second visit to the capital. In a boat furnished by government they left Rangoon, embarked for Ava, then the capital, and were immediately introduced to the king. Dr. Price was graciously received, but at the first interview Mr. Judson was scarcely noticed. Of the second interview we will give the account of Mr. Judson's own words. "Today the king noticed me for the first time. After some time he said, 'And you, in black, what are you, a medical man too?' 'Not a medical man, but a teacher of religion, your majesty.' He proceeded to make a few inquiries about my religion, and then put the alarming inquiry whether any had embraced it. I evaded by saying, 'Not here.' He persisted, 'Are there any in Rangoon?' 'There are a few.' 'Are they foreigners?' I trembled for the consequence of an answer which might involve the little church in ruin, but the truth must be sacrificed or the consequences hazarded, and I therefore replied, 'There are some foreigners and some Burmans.' He remained silent a few moments, but presently showed he was not displeased, by asking a great variety of questions on religion and geography and astronomy, some of which were answered in such a satisfactory manner as to occasion a general expression of satisfaction in all the court present. After his majesty retired, a royal secretary entered into conversation, and allowed me to expatiate on several topics of religion in my usual way, and all this took place in the presence of the very man, now at Atwenwoon, one of the highest officers, who many years ago caused his uncle to be tortured under the iron maul for renouncing Buddhism and embracing the Romish religion. Thanks to God for the encouragement of this day, the monarch of the empire has distinctly understood that some of his subjects have embraced the Christian religion, and his wrath has been restrained." He afterwards had another interview, in which the king inquired much about America, and authorized him to invite her ships to his dominions, assuring them of protection and facilities for trade. He mentions much flattering attention paid him by a prince of the empire and his wife, who was the king's sister, both of whom urged him not to return to Rangoon, but to bring his wife and reside at Ava. In fact, several dignitaries of the empire were so far attracted by the new theories in religion and science as to enter into animated discussion with the missionaries respecting them. The prince above mentioned was an interesting character. Mr. Judson went so far as boldly to urge upon him the duty of making personal religion his immediate care. For a moment he was moved, but soon replied that he was young, only 28, that he was desirous of enlarging his mind by an acquaintance with all foreign science, and then he could judge whether Christianity was worthy of his adoption or not. "But," said Mr. Judson, "suppose you change worlds in the meantime?" His countenance fell, and he said sadly, "It is true, I do not know when I shall die." How true it is, that "as in water face answereth to face, so doth the heart of man to man." Left without excuse, this poor impenitent Burman, like thousands in America, almost but not altogether persuaded to be Christians, postponed what he could not but purpose to a more convenient season. On another occasion, so many persons of high rank expressed themselves favorably to the Christian faith, that one who had not hitherto ventured to defend the missionaries in the presence of the king was bold enough to say, "Nearly all the world, your majesty, believe in an eternal God. All but Burma and Siam, these little spots." His majesty remained silent, and soon abruptly rose and retired. Before returning to Rangoon, Mr. Judson had an interesting interview with the king. "Why," asked the latter, "does the teacher return to Rangoon? Let him and Price stay together. If he goes, the other must remain alone, and will be unhappy." Some one present explained that he was going for his wife and goods, and would soon return. His majesty said, "Will you then come again?" and expressed a wish that he should do so and remain permanently. He and Dr. Price previously erected a house near Ava on some land granted them by the king, which was to be occupied by Dr. P. until Mr. Judson's return. The following letter from Mr. Judson, dated December 7th, 1823, announces the safe arrival of his wife in Rangoon. I had the inexpressible happiness of welcoming Mrs. Judson once more to the shores of Burmah on the 5th instant. We are now on the eve of departure for Ava. My last letter from Brother Price mentions that the king has inquired many times about my delay, and the queen has expressed a strong desire to see Mrs. Judson in her foreign dress. We sincerely hope her majesty's curiosity will not be confined to dress. Mr. and Mrs. Wade appear to be in fine health and spirits, and I am heartily rejoiced at their arrival just at the present time. Rumors of war between the British and Burmans were growing more and more prevalent, and alas, proved but too well founded. From the very last letter written by Mrs. Judson before this unhappy and disastrous war, we shall now make some extracts. Ava, February 10th, 1824. My dear parents and sister, after nearly 2 years and a half wandering, you will be pleased to hear that I have at last arrived at home, so far as this life is concerned, and am once more quietly and happily settled with Mr. Judson. When I retrace the scenes through which I have passed, the immense space I have traversed, and the various dangers, seen and unseen, from which I have been preserved, my heart is filled with gratitude and praise to that Being who has at all times been my protector and marked out all my way before me. We had a quick and pleasant passage from Calcutta to Rangoon, and in 7 days after our arrival there we were on our way to this place. Our progress up the river was slow indeed. The season, however, is cool and delightful. We were preserved from dangers by day and robbers by night, and arrived in safety in 6 weeks. The Irrawaddy is a noble river. We often walked through the villages on its banks, and though we never received the least insult, we always attracted universal attention. A foreign female was a sight never before beheld, and all were anxious that their friends and relations should have a view. Crowds followed us through the villages, and some less civilized than others would run some way before us in order to have a long look as we approached them. After relating conversation with the natives on the subject of religion, and a narrow escape from drowning, she comes to their arrival at Ava, where they had difficulties such as she had never before experienced. Dr. Price urged their going immediately to the house he had just erected, but it was of brick, and the walls still so damp that they did not dare occupy it. She says, "We had but one alternative, and that was to remain in the boat till they could build a small house on the piece of ground which the king gave Mr. J. last year, and you will hardly believe it possible, for I almost doubt my senses, that in just a fortnight from our arrival we moved into a house built in that time, which is large enough to make us comfortable. It is in a most delightful situation, out of the dust of the town, and on the bank of the river. Our house is in a healthy situation, is raised 4 feet from the ground, and consists of 3 small rooms and a veranda. We hardly know how we shall bear the hot season, which is just commencing, for our house is built of boards, and before night is heated like an oven. Nothing but brick is a shelter from the heat at Ava, where the thermometer, even in the shade, frequently rises to 108 degrees. We have worship every evening in Burman, when a number of the natives assemble, and every Sabbath Mr. Judson preaches the other side of the river in Dr. Price's house. We feel it an inestimable privilege that amid all our discouragements we have the language, and are able constantly to communicate truths which can save the soul." She then mentions that she has commenced a female school with 3 little girls, 2 of them given her by their parents, fine children who improve very rapidly, and that she has a prospect of more pupils. They did not immediately visit the palace, as the royal family were absent on a visit to Amarapura, their old capital, where they were to remain until the new palace in Ava should be finished. She found her old friend, the viceroy's wife, now degraded by the death of her husband to a low rank. But a sensible woman, and more capable, Mrs. J. thought of receiving religious truth than when in public life. She adds, in consequence of war with the Bengal government, foreigners are not in as much esteem at court as formerly. Even Americans shared the same disfavor as Englishmen, for being similar in features, dress, language, and religion. It is not surprising that the Burmans should have confounded them as subjects of one government, from the circumstances of money being remitted to them through English residents of Ava. They were even suspected of being paid spies of the East India Company, but this was at a somewhat later period. The capital of Burma is not fixed, but changes with the caprice of the monarch, for wherever he fixes his imperial residence, there for the time is the capital. Ava, the former capital, having been forsaken during the reign of the old king for Amarapura, was again to be the royal residence, and for this purpose a magnificent palace had been there erected, of which the emperor was now to take possession. On these occasions all the gorgeousness of Oriental magnificence has its full display. Such a scene the missionaries witnessed soon after their arrival at Ava. Mrs. Judson gives an animated description of that splendid day when Majesty, with all its attendant glory, entered the gates of the Golden City, and amid the acclamations of millions took possession of the palace. The numerous horses, the immense variety of vehicles, the vast number and size of richly caparisoned elephants, the myriads of people in their gala dresses, the highest officers in the kingdom drawn from the most distant as well as the nearer provinces to grace the occasion, each in his robes of state, the magnificent white elephant, caparisoned with silk and velvet and blazing jewels, the king and queen in simple majesty, alone unadorned amid the gaudy throng, surpassed any pageant ever exhibited in the Western world. Alas, this pomp and pride were soon to receive a disastrous humiliation. End of chapter 15.